Luc Jouret is standing at a lectern somewhere in French-speaking Europe in the late 1980s, and the program resting on the seat in front of each chair lists his credentials in small, even type. The qualifications are real. The degree in medicine from the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the clinical training, the years of practice, all of it is accurate, all of it is on the page, and the room is full. The audience is well dressed. The chairs are arranged in careful rows beneath lighting that is warm but not bright, and the evening's listed topics: natural healing, homeopathic philosophy, the relationship between human biology and planetary consciousness, have drawn exactly the kind of people a lecture like this tends to draw in a prosperous European city in the years before the millennium. Professionals with an appetite for something the conventional world has not quite provided. People who have already read widely and who are not, in their own estimation, easily fooled. Jouret speaks with the particular confidence of a man who knows two registers and moves between them without apparent effort. The medical vocabulary is present and precise. He uses it to establish that he is not a mystic, performing ignorance of science, but a trained clinician who has arrived, through study and practice, at a larger view of what medicine can be. The cosmological vocabulary comes later, rising through the medical like a second current in the same river, and by the time the audience has been sitting for 40 minutes, both registers feel like parts of a single coherent thought. That is the effect, and it is not accidental. This is where the story begins, not in a ritual chamber, not in a sealed document, not in the moment anything went wrong. It begins in a lecture hall. It begins with a printed program and a doctor's credentials and a room full of attentive people who came of their own accord and will leave, for the most part, thinking well of the evening. Luc Jouret was born in 1947 in the Belgian Congo, in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and his childhood was shaped by a colonial world already in its long recession, a world of European institutions planted in African soil, their authority assumed, their permanence taken for granted, right up until the moment it was not. He came back to Belgium for his education and completed his medical degree in Brussels at the Université Libre, training as a general practitioner before developing a parallel interest in homeopathy that would carry him steadily away from conventional clinical work and toward a different kind of audience. The trajectory was not unusual for its time. Across French-speaking Europe in the 1970s and 1980s, homeopathy occupied a position of real cultural prestige. It was practiced by educated people, discussed in serious publications, and held by many as not a rejection of scientific medicine, but an extension of it into subtler terrain. Jouret was good at arguing this case. He was, by every account that survives from this period, a compelling speaker, direct, informed, physically at ease at a lectern, able to hold a room for 2 hours without losing the thread. The lecture tours began as something close to a professional necessity, a way of building a practice, developing a reputation, finding patients in cities where he had not yet established himself, and they worked. But they were also, from early on, something else, a method of finding people. Not patients, exactly. People. The kind of people who would stay after the formal program had ended to ask further questions, who would collect the pamphlets left on the table near the door, who would respond to an invitation to join a smaller, more intimate discussion group, meeting the following week. Joseph de Mombreau was born in France in 1924, and his background was entirely different from Jouret's, less academic, less credentialed, more improvised. He had worked as a watchmaker and in jewelry, trades that ask for patience with small and precise mechanisms, and he had spent years navigating the margins of French spiritual life, before arriving at a version of himself that would prove far more durable than anything he had attempted before. Where Jore offered credentials and scientific coherence, Dimambro offered something older and harder to verify: authority. The particular authority of a man who presents himself as the keeper of knowledge that cannot be fully explained, only gradually disclosed. By the time the two men came into each other's orbit, Dimambro had already spent more than a decade building and managing spiritual organizations. He had been involved with groups connected to the Amorc Rosicrucian Order in France, and had eventually broken away to form his own community, the Foundation Golden Way, which operated in Geneva from the late 1970s and drew members interested in esoteric philosophy, solar cosmology, and the possibility that human spiritual life was connected to forces operating at a scale most institutions could not address. The Foundation Golden Way was not large. It occupied modest office space in Geneva, maintained filing cabinets, and a reception desk, and the ordinary administrative apparatus of a small private organization, and it held meetings. But it gave Dimambro a membership base, a set of established practices, and a financial structure. And when the conversation with Jure began to produce something more ambitious, those existing elements were available to carry forward. Geneva was the logical place. The city had, by the 1980s, accumulated a reputation for the discreet management of private affairs that made it hospitable to a certain kind of organization. Banks operated there under frameworks that prioritized confidentiality. Private associations could be constituted with relatively light external scrutiny. The infrastructure for establishing something formal and legally recognized without attracting undue attention was simply better in Geneva than it would have been almost anywhere else in Europe, and both men understood this. The city was also, more practically, a center of French-speaking European professional life, which was the world Jore's lecture tours were already navigating. The Ordre International Chevaleresque de Tradition Solaire, the Order of the Solar Temple, was formally constituted in Geneva in 1984. The full name was chosen with care. Every element of it was doing deliberate work. Ordre placed the organization within a French tradition of formal hierarchical bodies, with codified structures and recognized degrees. International signaled that its reach extended beyond any single country, that it was not a local curiosity, but something with scope. Chevaleresque, chivalric, reached backward through time to the medieval world of knighthood and sacred vows and a masculine spiritual culture organized around service to a higher cause. Tradition anchored everything in continuity rather than novelty, the suggestion being that this was not an invention, but a recovery, the same current, flowing again after a long interruption. And Solaire placed the sun at the center of everything, not as a metaphor, but as the organizing principle of a cosmology in which the visible sun and whatever lay behind it were the source of all genuine spiritual authority. The founding documents bore the full name in ornate French script, a red wax seal. The signatures of both men, Joret's and Dimambro's, placed beneath the title in the formal position that established them as the constituting authorities of the organization they had just brought into existence on paper. The document existed. It was typed, sealed, signed, and filed. This is not conjecture about intent or reconstruction from scattered evidence. It is a record that survived, and its survival matters because it tells something about how seriously the founders took the formal apparatus of their project. A group operating entirely on mystical authority and personal charisma does not necessarily bother with wax seals and notarized charters. Dimambro and Jure did. They built an institution. The institution had paperwork and the paperwork was correct. The Foundation Golden Way membership formed the initial pool from which the Solar Temple drew its first members, and this transition happened with the quiet efficiency of an organization that already knew how to manage a list. People who had been attending Dimambro's Geneva meetings simply found themselves, gradually, receiving correspondence from the new order, attending ceremonies that were more elaborate than the ones they had known before, paying fees that were higher than what the Foundation had asked, and moving through an initiatory hierarchy that had not existed 18 months earlier. The seam between the old organization and the new one was visible only from outside, and most of the people passing through it were not looking at it from outside. The three primary recruitment territories were French-speaking Switzerland, France itself, and Quebec, each of them a community of French-speaking professionals, sharing certain cultural assumptions about what seriousness looked like and what kinds of questions it was respectable to ask. The Solar Temple was not recruiting at the economic margins. It was recruiting from the established center of French-speaking professional life: doctors, lawyers, local politicians, business owners, people with university educations and established practices, and the resources to pay, over time, quite considerable sums of money for the privilege of belonging to something they believed was exceptional. Giraud's lecture tours were the primary mechanism. He moved through cities and towns in French-speaking Europe and Canada, speaking at venues that ranged from small private meeting rooms to public halls with real capacity, and the talks followed a consistent structure: homeopathy and natural medicine first, the credentialed, verifiable part of his background, the part that belonged to a world the audience already knew how to evaluate. Then the wider questions: planetary systems, ecological consciousness, the relationship between individual human health, and the larger forces governing biological life on Earth. And then, in the later portions of the evening, for audiences that had stayed and were ready, something more: references to traditions of spiritual knowledge older than contemporary medicine, to the possibility that the universe was organized around principles which modern scientific culture had not yet fully acknowledged. He was, by the accounts of people who attended these talks, not performing the role of a prophet. He was performing the role of a thoughtful man who had read carefully and followed his own inquiry to unexpected places. That distinction mattered enormously. An audience that might dismiss a self-declared prophet might happily spend 2 hours listening to a qualified physician describe his own intellectual journey, and arrive at the end of the evening with the pleasant sense of having been trusted with something genuine and carefully considered. The program on the chair was part of this: the printed list of credentials, the degree, the clinical training, the years of practice established Jehoka's standing before he said a single word. The audience had already read it while waiting for the talk to begin, already absorbed the information that this was a man with institutional standing in a field they respected. The lecture was building on a foundation that had been placed there quietly before the room even came to attention. Invitations to smaller gatherings followed for people who seemed interested, and these smaller gatherings were different in register from the public talks: more personal, more specific, more willing to engage with the esoteric dimensions of what Jaurès had introduced in the larger format. The process of moving someone from an audience member at a public lecture to an initiate in a formal organization was never presented as a single step. It unfolded across multiple meetings, multiple conversations, multiple readings of materials provided by the group at each stage. The pace was unhurried. The architecture of the recruitment was designed to feel like a natural deepening of interest rather than a structured process of progressive commitment. and it was effective precisely because the distinction between those two things was invisible from inside the experience. Initiation fees were real, and they were not small. The financial threshold for full membership was high enough to function as both a barrier and a signal. It excluded people who could not or would not pay, and it told those who did pay that they were committing to something that took itself seriously. The fees increased as a member moved through the group's internal hierarchy. Each new degree, each new level of the organization's tiered structure came with a corresponding financial obligation, and the money was received by Dimambro's administrative apparatus and recorded in the organization's accounts alongside contributions, gifts, and transfers of property that some members made as their involvement deepened. Initiatory certificates accompanied each stage of advancement. These were not informal documents. They were embossed with the group's full chivalric name, printed on good paper, dense with formal language that situated the recipient within a tradition of knightly spiritual lineage. The name of the new initiate appeared at the top in careful capital letters, and the document was signed by Dimambro in a dark ink that would, in later years, once these certificates began appearing in investigators' files, have faded to the brown of old correspondence. The certificate was handed across a table in a private room during one of the Solar Temple's early formal ceremonies. Not given, exactly, but presented, the physical transfer of a document whose weight was partly in what it said and partly in the attention with which it was received. Dimambro presided over these ceremonies with the undemonstrative authority of a man who has never needed to announce that he is in charge. He did not speak at length about his own history or explain his credentials in the way Giore explained his. His authority was expressed through management, through the precise running of the organization's internal logistics, the maintenance of its financial accounts, the handling of its property interests, and above all, through his role as the keeper of what he described as the group's sacred relics. The relics were kept in a display case. The case was locked behind glass, and the objects inside it were arranged on dark velvet in the careful way that institutions display things whose significance is meant to be felt before it is explained. To anyone outside the group's cosmology, the items inside the case would have appeared small and unremarkable, worn, handled, the kind of objects that accrue significance not from their material qualities, but from the stories told about them. Dimambro told those stories with measured conviction. He spoke of the relics as material proof of a lineage that extended back through centuries of spiritual tradition, as physical evidence that the Solar Temple was not an invention of 1984, but the current expression of something far older and far more authoritative than its recent founding date might suggest. The case occupied a private room. It was not displayed publicly, not shown to people who had not passed through enough of the group's initiatory structure to be considered ready for what it implied. Access to it was itself a form of recognition, to be shown the relics, to stand in the room where they were kept and hear Dimambro speak about them, was to be told, implicitly, that one had arrived at a level of trust and commitment that the organization recognized and valued. The members who stood in that room were, by every account that survives, people of education and professional standing who had come to the Solar Temple through genuine intellectual interest and who had, over the course of their involvement, invested real money, real time, and real portions of their social and personal identity in their membership. They were not naive. Several had postgraduate degrees. Several held positions of responsibility in their professional fields. The display case and the objects inside it, unremarkable to any outside eye, were experienced by these people as the material proof of something cosmically significant, and nothing in their ordinary professional lives had prepared them with an obvious framework for questioning that experience. The Foundation Golden Way offices in Geneva, where so much of this had begun, were not extraordinary spaces. Filing cabinets along one wall, a reception desk where new members signed their first paperwork, handing over their names and their contact details, and the first of what would become a much longer series of commitments. The administrative quality of the space, the ordinariness of it, was in its way reassuring. Organizations that intend to be taken seriously maintain proper offices. They keep records. They issue receipts. The filing cabinets and the reception desk said, without anyone having to say it aloud, that this was not a fringe project. It was a real institution with real procedures and a membership register that was carefully maintained. Across the late 1980s, that membership register grew. The recruitment in French-speaking Switzerland was steady and targeted, drawing from the professional networks Jaurès lecture circuit had already mapped. The French membership developed more slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as word of the group's reputation for intellectual seriousness spread through the kinds of networks in which word of such things travels. Professional associations, loosely organized spiritual study groups, the acquaintance networks of people who had attended the same kind of public lecture and found themselves afterward still thinking about what they had heard. Quebec was reached through Jaurès lecture tours in Canada, which followed the same format as the European talks and found a similar audience, French-speaking professionals, in a province where the particular combination of Catholic cultural inheritance, intellectual seriousness, and openness to esoteric spiritual traditions was, if anything, more pronounced than in Switzerland or France. By the end of the 1980s, the Solar Temple had a membership that numbered in the hundreds, spread across 3 countries, organized into regional lodges whose individual leaders reported to the central administrative structure, de Membro, managed from Switzerland. The hierarchy was real and was enforced through the language of spiritual advancement. To move up within the organization's internal structure was to be told that one was progressing toward a fuller understanding of the tradition, and the promise of that further understanding, for many members, sufficient motivation to continue meeting the financial and participatory obligations each new degree required. The organizational complexity of it, the tiered hierarchy, the regional structure, the formal initiatory system with its certificates and its ceremonies, was de Membro's particular contribution. Jaurès brought the public face, the credibility, the lecture circuit, the ability to stand in a room full of strangers and hold their attention while moving them gradually towards something they had not come to hear. De Membro provided the architecture, the procedures, the documents, the financial management, the internal politics of a hierarchical organization that needed someone capable of holding it together from the inside. The combination was effective. It produced something that felt from inside like a genuine institution with a documented history and a living chain of authority extending back through centuries of spiritual tradition. The founding year of 1984 was real. The Geneva registration was real. The certificates were real, and all of these real things were arranged around a claim that was not verifiable from outside the group's own system of authority, that the Solar Temple was the authentic continuation of a lineage older than anyone in the room. In the evenings, when a new member signed their first paperwork at the Foundation Golden Way's reception desk, or later, as the organization developed its own administrative apparatus, they were entering a world that had been built with considerable care for from real materials, real credentials, and real documents, real financial accounts, real property, real ceremonies conducted in real rooms. The care with which it had been built was itself part of the argument for its authenticity. Things that are built this carefully, the architecture implied, do not get built by people who are not serious. DiMambro was serious. That is not a moral claim. It is a practical observation about the quality of attention he brought to the management of the organization he had built, and that Jaurès' public presence had given a wider reach than any of DiMambro's previous projects had achieved. The filing cabinets were organized. The accounts were maintained. The initiatory procedures followed a consistent logic, and in a private room, the display case sat locked behind glass, its contents arranged on dark velvet, the objects inside small and worn, and carried with the complete seriousness of a man who had decided some time ago that this was what they were: proof of a lineage, evidence of an authority, the material anchor of a claim that ran beneath everything the organization said about itself, and on which quietly everything else depended. No one who stood in that room and looked at the objects through the glass, not the doctors, not the lawyers, not the local politicians who had attended a public lecture on natural medicine and followed the thread from there to here, thought to question what they were looking at with the part of themselves that evaluated evidence professionally. The part of them that had come to this room was not the professional part. It was the part that had sat in the lecture hall and followed the talk on planetary consciousness to its conclusion and felt afterward that something real had been touched. And for that part of a person, the display case was exactly what DiMambro said it was. The case rested quietly in its private room. The objects inside it sat on their velvet, small and unremarkable, holding within them, according to the only account available in that space, the material proof of a cosmic authority. No one present thought to question it. The room was still, the glass was locked, and the files in the cabinets along the other wall held in their careful order the names and degrees and financial records of every person who had come this far and would for now go no further without being invited. The chamber beneath the cherry farmhouse was empty before a ceremony began. The projection apparatus sat in its recess in the sanctuary wall, a compact mechanical unit, its lens aimed toward the center of the room, its timer mechanism still and waiting. The altar cloth had been arranged on the stone surface, its fabric smoothed flat along the edges, a Red Cross emblem at its center, catching what light the room contained. The ceiling was low, the space was circular. The amber glow of the lighting system was already warming to its operating temperature when no one was present to see it, casting a slow and even radiance across the floor, the altar, the empty space where initiates would eventually stand, and the recess in the wall where the lens sat quietly in the dark. That is where the solar temple's interior world becomes most particular, not in its written doctrines, not in the initiatory certificates signed by DiMambro in dark ink, but in the physical architecture of a room built to make a belief system felt in the body, not merely understood in the mind. The Egarthy, as DiMambro called the sanctuary, was not simply a place of worship, it was a precision instrument. Its lighting, its acoustics, its geometry, and its projection apparatus were all elements of a single designed experience, one in which the ordinary boundaries between what could be explained and what could only be witnessed were carefully arranged to dissolve. The name Agarthy came from theosophical mythology, a tradition that had circulated through Western occult movements since the 19th century, which held that an advanced civilization existed within or beneath the earth, a realm of spiritual masters whose influence shaped the surface world invisibly. Dimambro had drawn the name from this tradition as deliberately as he had drawn everything else in the sanctuary's design, and its use signaled to higher degree initiates that the space they were entering was not simply a basement meeting room, but a threshold between ordinary existence and something the group understood as genuinely older and more authoritative than anything the surface world had to offer. The word itself was a kind of claim, and it was a claim that the room, with its projection equipment and its timer mechanisms and its precisely arranged lighting, was built to support, to understand why the Agarthy was designed as it was. It is necessary to understand what the solar temple taught about the nature of reality, and that teaching reached back in its own account of itself to the 14th century and to an act of institutional destruction whose echoes Dimambro claimed were still actively shaping the world. The Knights Templar were founded in the early 12th century as a Catholic military order tasked with protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, and for nearly 200 years they accumulated a combination of military power, financial sophistication, and political influence that made them both indispensable and threatening to the European powers around them. Their suppression came swiftly and with considerable violence. Pope Clement V, operating in close cooperation with King Philip IV of France, issued the order dissolving the Brotherhood in 1307 and 1312. With the order's leadership arrested, tried on charges that included heresy and apostasy, and ultimately executed. The last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. The official history of the order ended there, its properties seized, its membership scattered, its institutional existence terminated by the combined authority of the Church and the French crown. Dimambro's position communicated to Solar Temple members with the same methodical deliberateness with which he organized the group's financial accounts and its initiatory records, was that this official history was incomplete. The outward Templar order had been destroyed, he taught. The inner order had not. A lineage of genuine Templar spiritual authority had passed forward through the centuries, transmitted through a succession of custodians whose identities had been concealed precisely because concealment was necessary for survival. This lineage had now arrived, intact and unbroken, in the Solar Temple. Dimambro and Jouret were not simply founding a new spiritual movement. They were continuing something whose roots preceded the Reformation, preceded the Renaissance, preceded the collapse of medieval Christendom, a thread that ran directly back to the burning of Jacques de Molay, and to whatever the original Templars had known that had made them dangerous enough to destroy. This was not framed as metaphor. The historical and spiritual continuity Dimambro described was presented to Inner Circle members as literal fact, as documented reality, whose documentation happened to be held within the group itself, in the objects Dimambro controlled, and in the initiatory records he maintained. The evidence for the claim was, by design, internal, and that design meant that the authority of the claim rested entirely on the credibility of the person making it, which was, again by design, Dimambro himself. The white robes worn during Solar Temple ceremonies carried the red cross at the shoulder. The ceremonial swords presented to initiates during advancement rites were laid on the altar cloth, whose own red cross emblem matched the one on the robe. The visual vocabulary of the ritual space was entirely continuous with the historical imagery of the Templar order. The same colors, the same symbols, the same combination of martial and sacred authority folded into a single ceremony. For a new initiate standing in the Agarthy for the first time, surrounded by that iconography in a room whose lighting had been calibrated to produce a specific emotional response, The lineage claim was not simply a piece of information to evaluate, it was an atmosphere to inhabit. The initiatory structure that placed members inside this atmosphere was organized along lines drawn from Masonic Lodge practice. Degrees were arranged in ascending sequence. Lower degree members received instruction in general esoteric themes, astrology, Rosicrucian symbolism, the Rose-Croix tradition's account of spiritual evolution, the general solar temple cosmology, in which the sun was the visible expression of a vast cosmic intelligence. These were the outer rooms of the doctrine. They were coherent, internally consistent, and not dramatically different from the material a curious person might encounter in any European occult reading circle of the period. The Rosicrucian tradition, from which a significant portion of this outer doctrine was drawn, had itself been circulating through Western European spiritual culture since the early 17th century, when a series of anonymous pamphlets announced the existence of a secret brotherhood of enlightened scholars working invisibly for the reform of human knowledge and the spiritual transformation of European civilization. The pamphlets produced an enormous response. Philosophers, scientists, and spiritual seekers across the continent attempted to make contact with a brotherhood that may never have existed as a formal organization, and the Rosicrucian mythos that grew from this episode became one of the most durable elements in the Western esoteric tradition, absorbed into Freemasonry, into Theosophy, into the various magical orders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and eventually into the Solar Temple's own initiatory framework. DeMambro was familiar with this tradition in some depth. His previous organization, the Foundation Golden Way, had drawn on similar material, and he built the outer layers of Solar Temple doctrine from it with the confidence of someone who understood how esoteric frameworks accumulate authority through their historical associations. The name itself, the invocation of a Rosicrucian heritage, the synthesis of Rose-Croix symbolism with Templar iconography, the grounding of both in the overarching solar cosmology, produced a doctrine that felt genuinely ancient and genuinely layered, as though membership in the Solar Temple connected a person not to a single tradition, but to a convergence of multiple old and serious streams of knowledge, whose meeting point was the Solar Temple itself. The solar cosmology that unified these elements taught that the sun was not merely a physical body. It was the visible surface of a cosmic intelligence, a being of a higher order whose emanations sustained all life and whose nature could be approached through specific practices and initiatory advancement as a relationship rather than simply as a fact. The soul, in Solar Temple teaching, was itself a fragment of this solar intelligence, a particle of light that had descended into material existence and was moving across multiple lifetimes back toward its source. Physical existence was understood as a temporary condition, meaningful in terms of the spiritual work it allowed, but not in itself the destination. The destination was always the return. This cosmology gave the group's initiatory structure its internal coherence. Each degree of advancement was understood not simply as the acquisition of new information, but as a genuine change in the initiate's relationship to the solar intelligence, a refinement, a clarification, a step closer to the source. The ceremonies that marked these transitions were not performative in the way that a purely social graduation ceremony might be. They were, within the group's belief system, functionally real. Something was understood to actually change in the initiate during the advancement rite, and the Agorthi, with its lighting system and its projection apparatus, was the physical space in which that change was witnessed and confirmed. What the projection apparatus produced during ceremonies has been described by investigators who examined the Cherry property after October 1994 as theatrical or holographic technology, a system capable of generating the appearance of luminous presences, of celestial phenomena, of figures and lights that materialized within the space of the sanctuary during the most elevated moments of the ritual sequence. The apparatus itself was compact, installed in the wall recess with the care of something meant to remain invisible to the people standing in the room. Its lens was aimed at the center of the space. Its timer mechanism was set to activate at specific points in the ceremony's progression. What members standing in the Agartha during a ceremony would have seen at those specific points was something that appeared to be outside the range of any explanation available within the room. A presence, a light that did not come from the fixtures. A figure, or the suggestion of a figure, appearing in the space above the altar and then dissolving back into the ambient glow of the chamber. In the context of the ceremony, the white robes, the ceremonial swords, the incense, the dimmed lighting, the accumulated weight of the initiatory preparation that had brought them to this room, the experience would have had very little competition from any skeptical interpretation that might otherwise have been available. The system had been in use across multiple years of solar temple operation by the time investigators examined it, and the testimony of former members who had witnessed its effects describes, with some consistency, the emotional and psychological weight of what those moments produced. A light appearing in a prepared space is a different event for a person who has spent months or years being prepared to witness it than it is for a forensic technician cataloging evidence items from a farmhouse sanctuary in the Swiss canton of Fribourg. The mechanism is the same. The experience is not. Dimambro also had the Agartha equipped with a concealed audio system. Former members described hearing, during ceremonies, voices that seemed to originate from within or beyond the altar space, voices that spoke in the register of authority, of ancient knowledge, of masters communicating from a plane of existence to which the ceremony had temporarily opened access. These voices were the voices of what the solar temple described as its spiritual hierarchy, advanced solar beings, ascended Templar lineage holders, intelligences whose guidance Dimambro claimed to channel and whose instructions shaped the group's direction. The audio equipment produced the acoustic experience of these presences speaking. The ritual context produced the frame within which that experience was understood as communication from genuine otherworldly sources, rather than as a recording played through a concealed speaker. It is worth holding these two systems, the projection apparatus and the audio system, alongside the theological claim about Templar lineage and the cosmological claim about the soul's solar nature, because together they describe a single integrated design. The doctrine provided the frame, the ceremonial context charged the atmosphere, the technological systems produced the evidence. What the initiate understood as their own direct experience of the supernatural was the product of all three elements operating simultaneously, in a space that had been built to make that convergence feel inevitable rather than engineered. None of this required the members who experienced it to be naive or simple. The Solar Temple drew its membership substantially from educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, business people, individuals accustomed to evaluating evidence and questioning claims in other areas of their lives. The design of the experience was not aimed at bypassing intelligence. It was aimed at something that operates alongside intelligence without being accessible to it in the ordinary way. The felt sense of genuine encounter, of contact with something larger than the self, of belonging to a lineage that extends in both directions through time and connects the person standing in the present moment to something both ancient and cosmic. Intelligence alone is not well equipped to dispute that kind of experience when it is being produced with sufficient care in a sufficiently charged environment by someone who has devoted considerable resources to producing it convincingly. The ceremonial swords that featured an advancement rites were not decorative. They were presented to initiates with the solemnity that the group's reading of Templar history attached to the knightly tradition. The sword as the instrument of the sacred warrior, the defender of the lineage, the guardian of the knowledge that had been passed down through centuries of concealment and was now in this room, in this ceremony, being entrusted to this person. The weight of the sword in the hands was part of the experience. The Red Cross emblem on the altar cloth beneath it was part of the experience. The lighting and the voices and the advancing degrees and the certificates signed in dark ink were all part of the same experience. A coherent world, internally consistent, elaborately supported, and closed to external verification by design. The initiatory certificates themselves were printed and signed documents, formal in their appearance, careful in their language, dense with Latin phrases and esoteric terminology that signaled membership in a discourse whose history stretched back through centuries of Western occult learning. Dimambro's signature appeared on them in the dark ink that would later, on the copies recovered by investigators, have faded to brown. The name of the recipient was printed across the top in careful capital letters. The group's full chivalric title, Ordre International Chevaleresque de Tradition Solaire, appeared in the heading, connecting the particular person named in the certificate to the institutional identity whose medieval and cosmic authority the document was designed to represent and confer. Receiving such a document in a private room during a formal ceremony, after a period of preparation whose length and intensity signaled the seriousness of what was happening, would have felt different from receiving any other kind of document. The care that had gone into its production, the formality of the language, the precision of the typography, the seal pressed into it, the signature placed on it, was the visible surface of an investment whose depth the ceremony was meant to make, felt rather than merely stated. The certificate was evidence, within the group's internal world, that something real had changed. The initiate was now different from what they had been before entering the room. The document confirmed it. The degree to which this inner world became a person's primary world varied considerably across the membership. Lower degree members moved in and out of the group's orbit with more freedom, attending lectures, participating in ceremonies at intervals, maintaining their ordinary professional and family lives alongside their solar temple membership without particular difficulty. The solar temple's outer presentation, grounded in Jure's medical credibility and the group's esoteric but not dramatically radical public face, did not immediately require a wholesale reorganization of a person's relationship to the rest of the world. For higher degree initiates, the calculus was different. The doctrines they were being introduced to, the apocalyptic assessment of Earth's condition, the theory of the soul's solar nature and its ultimate destination, the interpretation of solar temple membership as the fulfillment of a multi-lifetime mission, were not compatible in the long run with maintaining an ordinary set of priorities and relationships outside the group. A person who genuinely believed they were a solar being, incarnated for a specific cosmic purpose, belonging to a lineage of Templar knowledge that had survived the 14th century and was now approaching its culminating moment in history, would find that belief increasingly difficult to hold lightly. It becomes, at a certain depth, the most important thing, which means everything else becomes organized around it. Dimambro understood this dynamic. The tiered degree structure was, among other things, a system for managing the rate at which the more demanding elements of the doctrine were introduced. The outer degrees provided the vocabulary and the emotional orientation. The middle degrees deepened the commitment and the sense of special identity. The inner degrees presented the full architecture of the belief system, including its account of where the present moment in history stood and what that meant for the people who understood themselves to be solar beings in possession of the relevant knowledge. Each layer prepared the initiate for the next. Each ceremony marked a transition whose weight was sufficient to make retreat feel costly and continuation feel natural. The Rosicrucian and Masonic frameworks that shaped the initiatory structure had themselves been designed across centuries of esoteric tradition to produce exactly this graduated deepening of commitment and identity. Dimambro did not invent the mechanism. He applied it with the thoroughness of someone who had studied it carefully and understood both its architecture and its effect on the people who moved through it. His previous organization, the Foundation Golden Way, had operated on similar principles, and the transition of its membership into the Solar Temple brought with it a cohort of individuals who had already moved some distance down the initiatory path, and for whom the Solar Temple's deeper doctrines were not a shock but a continuation. The sun itself, the actual sun, the one visible above every property where Solar Temple ceremonies were conducted, held a particular place in the group's physical as well as theological experience. Jouret's public lectures, which served as the Solar Temple's primary recruitment mechanism, consistently returned to the theme of solar consciousness, the sun as a living intelligence, the natural world as its expression, ecological crisis as the symptom of a civilization that had lost its relationship to this source. These were not fringe ideas in the late 1980s European environmental and alternative spirituality scene. They resonated with concerns and intuitions that a significant portion of Jouret's professional class audience already held, and they provided a bridge between the ordinary world of environmental concern and planetary awareness and the more specific, more demanding doctrine that waited inside the Solar Temple's initiatory structure. The bridge was carefully built. A person attending a Jouret lecture on natural healing and planetary consciousness would hear nothing that seemed dramatically outside the range of educated alternative spirituality. They would hear a doctor speaking with apparent authority about the relationship between human health and cosmic order, about the sun's role in sustaining life at every level, about the need for a more conscious relationship to the natural systems that conventional modernity had disrupted. The appeal was genuine, the concerns were real, and the person who found themselves moved by the lecture and curious about what more might be available was not displaying credulity. They were displaying a kind of interested openness that the Solar Temple was specifically designed to meet. What waited on the other side of that openness, behind the initiatory structure and the algarthy and the projection apparatus in the wall recess, was a complete world, a world with its own history, its own cosmology, its own account of what the present moment meant in the arc of a story that reached back to the medieval Templars and forward to a destination the group identified with Sirius and the solar source. It was a world that took the concerns of its recruits about the state of the planet, about the nature of consciousness, about the possibility of a spiritual reality beneath the surface of ordinary life, and gave them a home, a tradition, a lineage, and a set of ceremonies whose physical staging made the entire architecture feel genuinely real. The solar cosmology taught that the sun was the visible expression of a cosmic intelligence, and that death, understood correctly, was a return of the purified soul to its solar source, not an ending, but a completion, a closing of the circuit that had opened when the soul descended into material existence. This teaching ran through every level of the group's doctrine, from the outer cosmological framework, available to lower degree members, to the more specific and urgent version of the transit theology that inner circle members were introduced to as the group moved through the early 1990s. The soul belonged to the sun. The journey away from it was temporary. The journey back was the point. In this context, the elaborate stagecraft of the Agarthy, the projected presences, the disembodied voices, the amber light warming to its operating temperature in an empty room, was not simply a deception. It was, within the group's own framework, a representation of something the doctrine held to be genuinely real. The presences the projection apparatus manifested were representations of the solar hierarchy, the advanced beings whose existence the theology described, and whose guidance Di Mambro claimed to be in contact with. The staging made visible what the doctrine described, whether the members who stood in the room during ceremonies distinguished between the representation and the reality it represented, or whether the experience had collapsed. Those two things entirely varied from person to person and from ceremony to ceremony. The amber light in the empty chamber, warming to its operating temperature before anyone arrived, was operating according to its timer, regardless of whether it was witnessed. The lens in the wall recess was aimed at the center of the room, regardless of whether anyone stood in its path. The altar cloth was arranged, the sword was placed, the certificate was sealed in its envelope in the wooden cabinet. The Agarthy was ready. The ceremony had not yet begun. The chamber held all of its prepared weight in the stillness before the first initiate descended the steps and crossed the threshold. What that weight consisted of, assembled over years of careful construction, was a complete account of what the world was and what the people who understood it were, an account reinforced by every visual element in the room, every degree advanced through, every certificate handed across a table in a private ceremony, every voice heard in the charged atmosphere of a ritual whose preparation had made the experience it offered feel not merely plausible, but necessary. The initiatory certificate that waited in the wooden cabinet, its text dense with Latin phrases, its seal still pressed firmly into the paper, bore the name of whoever would next advance through the solar temple's degrees, printed in careful capital letters across the top, waiting to confirm a change that the ceremony would shortly declare had been made. That certificate, once handed over, would be held by its recipient as a document, a physical thing with weight and edges and ink on paper, faded now in whatever collection finally received it, the Latin phrases still legible across the interior pages, the seal still intact on its surface, Di Mambro's signature in the brown faded ink that had once been dark. The file that held it, recovered in the investigative period that followed the Cherry events, was eventually cataloged and stored. The document remained in it. The name printed at the top in careful capital letters remained precisely where it had been placed, the recipient identified, the degree confirmed, the cosmic lineage asserted in formal language that did not require anyone still living to interpret it. The page is slightly yellowed at the edges, the paper holding that particular tone that comes not from age alone, but from being stored in a sealed envelope for months before anyone outside the group was permitted to read it. The salutation at the top is formal, addressed by name to a journalist working for a Swiss newspaper, the greeting measured and composed, the opening sentence announcing that what follows is a communication of some importance and should be understood in that spirit. The ink is dark and deliberate throughout, the lines even, The margins observed with the kind of care a person brings to a document they have thought about for a long time before sitting down to write. This was one of several such documents prepared by Solar Temple leadership in the months before October 1994, documents they called testaments, written in the vocabulary of theological explanation, addressed to people outside the group, as though the group's final act required a public record of its reasoning, a statement of position composed in advance and left for those who would still be here to read it. To understand why such a document was written at all, it is necessary to spend some time inside the belief system that made writing it feel not only reasonable, but necessary. The Solar Temple's theology was not assembled quickly or carelessly. It accumulated across years, drawing from multiple traditions, synthesizing historical claims with cosmological frameworks, and weaving them together into a structure that from the inside held the weight of complete conviction. To the group's inner circle members, the testaments were not farewell letters in any ordinary sense. They were doctrinal statements. They were announcements of a transition that the group's theology had long described as the highest possible fulfillment of a solar being's purpose on this earth. The doctrine began with the earth itself. Joreth had spent years delivering public lectures on environmental crisis and ecological degradation, talks framed in the language of natural medicine and planetary consciousness, attended by professionals who found his arguments both scientifically grounded and spiritually resonant. Inside the group, the same themes carried a heavier weight. The Earth was not merely threatened, it had entered, the Solar Temple taught, a terminal phase, a condition of spiritual and material collapse from which no recovery was available through ordinary human effort. The institutions of civilization, the social structures within which ordinary life proceeded, the political frameworks that organized collective existence, none of these could address what was actually occurring at the deepest level of planetary reality. The degradation was not a problem to be solved. It was a conclusion already written. Jure communicated this with increasing urgency throughout the early 1990s. What had begun in his public lectures as a measured concern for environmental sustainability had, in the inner circle communications circulated among the group's higher degree members, taken on a different character entirely. The language was more absolute. The timeline was compressed. The gap between what the group knew and what the general public was able to understand had widened to the point where continued engagement with ordinary social life felt, to committed members, increasingly beside the point. The earth was ending. This was not metaphor. In the Chiking, it was the foundational premise on which everything else the group taught rested, and it had been taught consistently enough and long enough that for those at the highest levels of the Solar Temple's internal hierarchy, it did not feel like a claim requiring ongoing proof. It felt like settled ground. What followed from that premise was the doctrine of transit. Death, when understood through the Solar Temple's theological framework, was not what the uninitiated believed it to be. It was not an ending. It was a passage, and the nature of the destination depended entirely on the spiritual preparation of the one who made the crossing. For ordinary souls, death was a dissolution, a return to the undifferentiated material cycle of incarnation and forgetting. But for a solar being, and this was the category into which the Solar Temple taught its inner circle members to place themselves, death undertaken consciously, in a state of spiritual readiness and ritual preparation, was something categorically different. It was transit. It was departure. It was the fulfillment of a cosmic purpose that had been set across multiple lifetimes and was now, at last, arriving at its proper conclusion. The destination the group named was Sirius. The significance of that choice was not arbitrary. Sirius appears in ancient Egyptian religion as the star associated with Isis and with the annual flooding of the Nile, a celestial body linked across millennia to cycles of renewal, to sacred time, to the connection between the earthly and the divine. In the theosophical tradition that contributed substantially to the solar temple's synthetic theology, Sirius held a place of particular importance as a seat of advanced spiritual intelligence, a star associated with the higher masters and cosmic hierarchies that the theosophical system described as guiding human evolution from a distance. Dimambro had absorbed these traditions across decades of involvement in esoteric circles, and he wove them into the solar temple's framework with the fluency of someone who had lived inside them long enough to treat their terms as natural rather than adopted. Sirius, in the solar temple's cosmology, was not simply a star in the astronomical sense. It was a higher dimensional realm, a plane of existence appropriate to beings of the solar type, a place where the purified soul would arrive after transit and find itself in the company of the advanced intelligences that had, across multiple incarnations, guided its development on Earth. The transit was not, therefore, a death in any diminished sense. It was a graduation. It was the moment at which the soul completed the particular phase of its long journey that had required it to inhabit a physical body on a planet now past its moment of transformation, and departed for the environment to which it had always, at its deepest level, belonged. Dimambro taught this with the authority of someone who presented himself not merely as a teacher, but as a cosmic functionary, a figure whose role within the solar temple was not simply organizational, but ontological, a person who had been placed in his position by forces operating at the level of interplanetary consciousness. His claims about his own status within the cosmic hierarchy grew more elaborate across the years. He described himself as having direct contact with the masters, the ascended beings whose communications, delivered through the concealed speaker systems installed in the Agartha sanctuary, members experienced as genuine supernatural manifestations during ceremonies. The same theatrical infrastructure that produced the glowing apparitions during ritual also produced the voices. The voices gave instructions. They confirmed doctrine. They addressed Dimambro by the titles he had assigned himself within the group's cosmological hierarchy, and members who heard them in the charged atmosphere of the sanctuary found them difficult to distinguish from genuine spiritual communication. All of this formed the background against which the transit doctrine operated. The promise of Sirius, the conviction that the Earth had exhausted its capacity for spiritual life, the belief that solar temple members were solar beings whose destiny lay above and beyond this world. These were not new ideas in 1994. They had been in circulation within the group for years, introduced gradually as members advanced through the initiatory degrees, becoming more specific and more demanding the deeper into the hierarchy a member moved. By the time a member had reached the inner circle, the transit was not a distant theological possibility. It was the described shape of their own future. It was the event toward which their entire spiritual life had been oriented. The question of timing was the one thing that had not been fixed. And then, in July 1994, it appeared to be answered from the sky. Between July 16th and July 22nd of 1994, fragments of the comet designated Shoemaker-Levy 9 struck the surface of Jupiter in a sequence of impacts that astronomers had predicted months in advance, and that the global scientific community observed with instruments trained on the gas giant's atmosphere. The impacts left visible dark scars on Jupiter's surface, regions of altered atmosphere that could be seen through amateur telescopes and that appeared in photographs distributed widely by space agencies and news organizations, For the scientific community, the event was a rare opportunity to observe a major solar system collision in something close to real time. The photographs were striking. The impact energies were enormous. The dark marks on Jupiter's surface were visible for weeks afterward. For Dimambro, studying those photographs inside one of the solar temple's properties in the summer of 1994, the event was something else entirely. The internal documents circulated to Inner Circle members in the months that followed incorporated the showmaker Livy 9 impacts as direct cosmic confirmation, a signal delivered at the level of planetary bodies within the solar system that the time the group had been preparing for had arrived. The comet had struck Jupiter. The sky had spoken in the only language capable of communicating with beings at the solar temple's level of cosmic awareness. The period of waiting was over. This interpretation was recorded in the group's internal communications in a way that drew explicit connections between the astronomical event and the transit timeline. A handwritten notation in the margin of one solar temple doctrinal document, added sometime in mid-1994, references Sirius by name alongside a date circled in pencil, the kind of mark a person makes not in the act of working something out, but in the act of recording a conclusion already reached. The connections were then elaborated in more formal internal writing, the language shifting from the exploratory register of doctrinal development into the settled register of doctrinal statement. The comet had confirmed what the group already believed. The question of timing had been resolved not by human calculation, but by an event in the solar system that Dimambro identified as a message, addressed specifically to those with the cosmological framework to read it. An astronomical chart, annotated in French in Dimambro's hand, shows the positions of Sirius, Jupiter, and the Sun connected by lines drawn with a ruler. The labels along those lines use terminology drawn from the group's internal cosmological vocabulary, terms developed across years of doctrinal elaboration that would be opaque to anyone outside the group, but would be immediately legible to any member who had advanced past the lower initiatory degrees. The chart is precise in its astronomical information and idiosyncratic in its interpretation of that information. The star positions are accurate. The meanings assigned to their arrangement belong entirely to the solar temple's own framework, drawn from theosophical and Rosicrucian sources, filtered through decades of Dimambro's synthetic theological work, and applied to a real astronomical event, with the full conviction of someone for whom the two registers, the empirical and the cosmological, had long since merged into a single way of reading the world. The testaments that followed were written in that same merged register. They addressed their recipients, journalists, former members, government officials, public figures, with the tone of people explaining something to those who lacked the context to understand it fully, but who might, with the help of a careful explanation, arrive at something approximating comprehension. The writing is not frantic. It is not the writing of people in crisis. It is formal, considered prose that treats the transit as a theological position requiring exposition rather than as a decision requiring justification. The distinction matters. A justification implies doubt, or at least the awareness that doubt is possible in the reader. The testaments do not acknowledge doubt. They explain what the documents describe in careful paragraphs is the transit understood in detailed theological and procedural terms. The Earth's terminal condition is stated as established fact. The category of the solar being is explained with the confidence of an established classification. The destination of Sirius is named, and its significance within the group's cosmological framework is traced through its connections to Egyptian religious tradition and the theosophical lineage from which the solar temple drew. The comet's impact on Jupiter is referenced as confirmation. The appropriate response, the transit itself, is described not as chosen, but as indicated, as the natural and necessary conclusion of the doctrinal sequence the group had been following for years. What is striking, reading these documents in the archival record they eventually became, is the extent to which the theology had insulated itself against external evaluation. The very features of ordinary life that might have created distance from the group's doctrines, professional commitments, family relationships, engagement with scientific or political discourse, were reinterpreted within the solar temple's framework as signs of attachment to a world that was ending. The members who were most committed to the group were those who had, over years of gradual initiatory deepening, moved furthest from the social identities that might have provided a counterweight to the group's internal logic. The doctrine had arranged itself so that the strongest position within its own hierarchy corresponded to the position of greatest isolation from the perspectives that might have questioned it. The testaments were composed across several months, the writing spread among DeMambro and senior members, the various documents addressed to different categories of recipient, with variations in their level of doctrinal detail. Some versions are more technical, more explicitly concerned with the cosmological framework. Some are more personal, acknowledging named individuals and specific relationships with a warmth that coexists, without apparent strain, alongside the announcement of imminent departure. The pages across these documents run to a considerable length when taken together. The group's final theological communication to the outside world was not brief. It was thorough. It was assembled with the same care that had been brought to every other aspect of the solar temple's internal operations across its decade of active existence. A stack of sealed envelopes, each one addressed in the same careful hand to a different recipient, sat on a table inside one of the group's properties in the weeks before the October events. The names on the outer envelopes were a varied list: journalists from Swiss and French newspapers, former members who had left the group in earlier years, officials whose positions touched on the areas the testaments addressed. Each envelope held a version of the same essential theological statement, adapted in its tone and emphasis to the presumed context of its particular recipient. The addresses were written with the same even, deliberate script visible on the internal documents. Nothing about the physical presentation of the envelopes suggested haste or agitation. They were prepared in the way a person prepares correspondence that is important to get right, returned to, reread, sealed when complete. The language the testaments use for the transit is consistently that of departure rather than death. The distinction was not incidental. It reflected the genuine theological structure within which the documents were composed. Transit was the precise term the solar temple had developed for the crossing it described, a word that carried its own weight within the group's vocabulary, distinct from the ordinary language of dying. Freighted with the specific meanings the doctrine had assembled around it, across years of ritual and initiatory teaching. To translate transit into the more ordinary word it outwardly resembled would have been, from within the group's own framework, to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of what was being described. The testaments do not use the word death. They use transit consistently, as though the difference between the two terms were a factual rather than a semantic distinction, which, within the solar temple's own doctrinal structure, it was. The relationship between the transit doctrine and the comet's impact deepened in the months between July and October 1994. The internal communications circulating through the group's inner circle during this period show a movement from doctrinal elaboration toward what might be called doctrinal finalization. the sense of a theological system arriving at the point where the remaining work is not further development, but execution. The astronomical event had provided a timestamp, the testaments provided the explanation, the envelopes provided the external record. The theology had, in its own terms, done everything theology was supposed to do. It had described the world, identified the appropriate response to the world's condition, and provided the framework within which that response could be understood as not merely reasonable, but obligatory. Outside this framework, of course, the same events read entirely differently. The comet's impact on Jupiter was a natural solar system event of great scientific interest. The testaments were documents written by people in the grip of a belief system that had progressively narrowed the range of available interpretations until the transit appeared as the only coherent conclusion. The sealed envelopes were prepared by a leadership that had, in the financial records later examined by Swiss and Canadian investigators, been systematically redirecting member contributions into personal accounts, evidence of a relationship between the leadership and the group's membership that was not straightforwardly the one the testaments described. But the documents themselves do not contain any of this. They contain instead a complete and internally coherent theological world, one assembled with care across a decade, drawn from real historical traditions, elaborated in real ritual spaces, and experienced by real people as genuinely transformative. The Solar Temple's theology was not the invention of a single evening. It had roots in Templar mythology and Rosicrucian doctrine and theosophical cosmology and Egyptian religious symbolism. It had been communicated through initiatory ceremonies conducted in a purpose-built sanctuary. It had been reinforced by what members experienced in the charged atmosphere of the Agarthy as genuine encounters with spiritual presences. The testaments were written from within a world that was to those inside it as solid and as documented as the world the investigators would later move through when they arrived at the same properties. One handwritten notation in a doctrinal document margin, the date circled in pencil next to the name of Sirius, is a small thing in itself. It is the kind of mark anyone makes in the margin of a document when something clicks into place, when the pieces of a framework suddenly align with an external event in a way that feels like confirmation rather than coincidence. The pencil line is light, almost casual in its pressure, as though the act of circling the date required very little force, as though what it was recording was not a decision but a recognition, the acknowledgement of something the writer already knew and was simply now seeing, confirmed in the movements of the sky. The astronomical chart, with its ruler-drawn lines connecting Sirius, Jupiter, and the Sun, is more formal, more deliberate, a document meant to be read by others, to communicate a cosmological position to members who would receive it as part of the group's internal circulation of materials in the months before October. The chart's annotations are precise where the astronomical data is concerned, and interpretive where the cosmological framework applies. The lines are clean, the labels are legible. The overall impression is of a document composed by someone who knew exactly what they were trying to show and had the technical vocabulary to show it in a form that inner circle members would find immediately comprehensible. These two documents, the penciled margin notation and the annotated astronomical chart, sit in the archival record as physical evidence of the period between July and October 1994, when the Solar Temple's theology passed through its final phase of consolidation. They are not dramatic objects. They are the ordinary working papers of a theological system arriving at what it understood as its conclusion, marginal notations and annotated charts of the kind that accumulate in any body of serious doctrinal work, distinguished from other such papers only by the nature of the conclusion they were building toward. The testaments, by contrast, were intended to be public documents. They were the solar temple's communication to the outside world, the record the group chose to leave behind for those who would remain after the transit. They were composed with awareness of an audience, written to be read by people who would encounter them without the initiatory context that would make them immediately comprehensible, and therefore explained with a thoroughness that internal documents addressed to members already embedded in the group's framework did not require. The testaments are, in this sense, the solar temple's attempt to translate its interior world into a form that could survive contact with the exterior. They are addressed to people who did not share the group's cosmological premises, and they proceed as though those premises can be made comprehensible through sufficiently careful exposition. Whether that exposition succeeded in its own terms is a question the documents themselves cannot answer. The recipients never replied. The envelopes sat on the table as the weeks passed, their addresses written in the same careful hand on each one, waiting for the moment they would be sent. Some of them eventually reached their recipients, delivered after October, after the fires, after Swiss and Canadian investigators had already photographed them as evidence. By then, the communication had become a different kind of document than the one it had been intended to be. What was composed as theological explanation became, in the hands of investigators and journalists, something more closely resembling an evidentiary record, the written remains of a belief system that had followed its own internal logic to the end of the path that logic had made available. The page remains slightly yellowed at the edges. The ink is still dark where the salutation is written, and slightly lighter in the longer paragraphs further down the page, where the pen had been moving for some time and the ink had begun to thin. The lines are even throughout. The margins are observed. The formal structure of the document holds across all its pages, the careful paragraphs, the theologically precise vocabulary, the measured tone of someone explaining something they understand very well to someone they expect will find it difficult to understand at all. The stack of sealed envelopes on the table inside the group's property, photographed by investigators weeks after October, addressed in the same hand to journalists and former members and officials whose names had been written out with the same unhurried care given to every other written document the solar temple produced, sat undisturbed in the investigators' photographs, the addresses legible, the seals intact, the correspondence undelivered or delivered too late for any reply to have been composed or sent. The handwriting on each envelope is consistent. The stamps are correctly placed. The return address, where one appears, corresponds to a solar temple property that investigators had by then already documented in detail. None of the envelopes in the photographs show any sign of having been opened from the outside. They hold their contents in the same sealed state in which they were prepared, the theological position inside each one intact, the explanation still folded along its original creases, the argument still arranged in its careful paragraphs, still addressed to its named recipient, still waiting, in the formal sense of correspondence, not yet answered, for a reply that the circumstances of October 1994 had made permanently impossible. The stack sits in the investigative photograph exactly as it sat on the table before anyone from outside arrived. The addresses face upward. The envelopes are slightly overlapping, arranged with a looseness that suggests they were gathered together rather than deliberately stacked. The final accumulation of months of correspondence preparation, the last physical record of the solar temple's effort to leave a written account of its theology for the world it was preparing to depart. The light in the photograph is flat. the kind of light produced by the flash equipment used in forensic documentation. The table is ordinary. The envelopes are ordinary. The hand that addressed them is in the archival record. None of the envelopes ever answered. The forensic photograph of the Cherry farmhouse doorway shows a stone threshold, a narrow frame, and stone steps descending into a space below ground level. Numbered evidence markers have been placed at intervals along the floor. Small yellow placards, each printed with a black numeral, standing at the edges of the frame in the careful grid that investigators use to make a space readable before anything is moved. The steps themselves are unremarkable, the kind of steps that might lead to a cellar or a utility room in any rural Swiss farmhouse. The doorway is low, the threshold is worn. What lay beyond it in the early hours of October 5th, 1994, was a circular room beneath the Cherry property in the Swiss canton of Fribourg, and the documented record of what was found there occupies a case file that has since been stored, stamped, and catalogued in the archives of the Swiss Cantonal Authority. It was before dawn when emergency services first arrived at the Cherry farmhouse. A fire had been reported. The structure above ground was burning, and the first responders attended to that. The heat, the smoke, the containment of a fire in a rural building in the early morning dark. The sanctuary below was found in the course of that response, not before it. The steps led down from a passage inside the farmhouse, and whoever followed them into the room below found what the investigative summary later described in measured, procedural language. 23 people, arranged in a circular pattern, in a low-ceilinged room that had been fitted with an altar and a projection apparatus, and walls hung with the materials of the group's ceremonial life. The altar cloth was still in place. The projection equipment was still installed in the wall recess. The room was still. The fire above had been set on a timer. Incendiary devices had been installed inside the walls of the farmhouse. Compact mechanical components connected to delay mechanisms set to activate at a specific hour after the events in the room below were complete. Investigators would later recover the remains of these devices from the wall cavities of the Cherry property, photograph them on forensic examination tables alongside numbered evidence tags, and enter their description into the case file in the straightforward language of material evidence. The mechanisms were not improvised. The delays were precise. The fires at Cherry were not the result of an accident or a decision made in the moment. They had been planned, and the technical preparation required to plan them had taken place over a period the investigation estimated at weeks or months before the night itself. 23 people were found in the Agarthy sanctuary. Some had their hands bound. Forensic examination established injection marks on certain of the dead, consistent with sedation administered before death, and gunshot wounds were documented that were not consistent with self-infliction. Others showed no such signs. The investigation's finding, arrived at over months of forensic and documentary analysis, was that the circular room at Cherry held both people who had been killed by others and people who had, by the available evidence, participated willingly. This was not a simple finding, and the investigators did not present it as one. The case file holds the documented evidence. The determination of what that evidence means, in terms of individual decision and individual coercion, is the work the file records without fully resolving. On the same night, fires broke out in the mountain village of Granges-sur-Salvan in the canton of Valais. 2 wooden chalets stood in that village, owned through the network of property holdings that the Solar Temple maintained across French-speaking Switzerland. Both burned in the early hours of October 5th. When Swiss authorities reached the sites and the fires were sufficiently contained to allow access, The bodies of 25 people were recovered from the ruins. Among them were Luc Jouret and Joseph de Mambro, the two figures whose names appear at the head of the group's founding documents, on its initiatory certificates, and in the internal correspondence that investigators would spend months cataloging. Senior members of the group's inner circle were also among the dead at Grangy-sur-Selven. The two chalets were reduced to their stone foundations in the alpine cold, and the mountain landscape behind them, visible in the photographs Swiss authorities took that morning, was unchanged: pale rock, gray sky, the early light, making no distinction between the ruins and the terrain around them. The time devices at Grangy-sur-Selven were recovered from the chalet's wall structures in the same manner as those at Cherry. The mechanisms matched in their general design, installed in advance, connected to delay timers set to activate at an hour after the principal events of the night. Investigators examining both Swiss sites in the days that followed documented the incendiary apparatus at each location and noted the consistency of the approach. The same technical logic applied in two separate buildings in two separate locations on the same night. The fires were not parallel accidents. The fires were parallel plans. The combined Swiss total, 23 at Cherry and 25 at Granges-sur-Salvan, did not represent the full extent of what occurred on that date. On October 4th, 1994, the day before the Swiss fires, 5 members of the Solar Temple were found dead at a property in Morin Heights in the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec, Canada. The Morin Heights property was a modest chalet set among trees, its exterior unremarkable in the archival photographs that documented it before law enforcement access was restricted. The interior became part of a Canadian law enforcement record that would remain sealed for years. Among the 5 people found at Morin Heights were Christopher Emmanuel Dutoit, who was 3 months old, and his parents. The total number of people found dead across both countries in less than 24 hours was 53. The Morin Heights deaths preceded the Swiss fires by some hours. The child's name appears in the Canadian law enforcement documentation and in the press coverage that followed, and it appears in the written testaments that de Mambro and senior members had composed in the months prior, documents that addressed the transit in theological terms and were intended for distribution to journalists, former members, and public figures. The testaments described the deaths not as murder or suicide, but as a voluntary spiritual departure, and the language used in those documents to account for all who would die was the language of the group's own cosmology: the transit, the passage, the solar destination. The testaments had been prepared in advance, the envelopes had been addressed in advance, the fires had been planned in advance. These are the things the record establishes. The Cherry case file, in its early pages, includes a site map of the property. The farmhouse is drawn at the top of the page, the roof lines indicated with thin lines, the entrance noted with a small arrow. Below the farmhouse drawing, connected by a dotted line indicating the internal passage, is the outline of the sanctuary space, circular, with the altar position marked at one end and the projection apparatus position marked in the wall recess opposite. The map is the work of an investigator who had walked the space and needed to convey its dimensions and layout to others who had not. It is precise in the way that such maps must be precise. The measurements noted in the margins, the scale indicated at the bottom, the cardinal directions marked in the corner, a room drawn on a page for the purpose of being understood by people whose work requires understanding it. Swiss investigators working across the Cheery and Granges-sur-Salvan sites in October 1994 operated under the authority of the cantonal judicial systems of Fribourg and Valais, respectively. The two investigations were separate in their jurisdictional structure, but coordinated in their practical execution, given the evident connection between the two sets of events. The case files that accumulated in the weeks following October 5th included forensic reports, site photographs, evidence logs, inventory lists of recovered materials, and the documentary record of what had been found on the properties. The testaments, the initiatory documents, the correspondence, the financial records, and the physical apparatus of the group's ritual life. Investigators cataloged the projection equipment, they cataloged the ceremonial swords, they cataloged the robes, the certificates, the sealed envelopes addressed for distribution. The archive that resulted from this work was substantial, and it held within it the record of an organization whose internal life had been largely invisible to the Swiss authorities, who were now for the first time in full possession of its material remains. The forensic examination of the dead at Cherry produced findings that the investigation summarized carefully, and that the subsequent court and coroner proceedings handled with equivalent care. The presence of bound hands on certain of the victims was documented in the forensic record. The injection marks were noted, their positioning and character described in the clinical language of forensic medicine. The gunshot wounds were examined for their trajectory and character, and the findings regarding self-infliction were entered into the record as technical determinations, not as moral conclusions, but as the outputs of the established methods of forensic examination. These findings, taken together, supported the investigative conclusion that not everyone found in the Agarthy sanctuary had died in the same manner or with the same degree of agency. Some had been killed, others appeared, by the forensic evidence available, to have been willing participants in the events of that night. This distinction between those who were murdered and those who within the group's own framework had chosen what occurred was one the investigation took seriously and documented with precision. It was also a distinction that the testaments themselves did not make. The written documents DeMambro and senior members had prepared presented the transit as a unified act, a collective departure, a shared passage toward the solar destination the group's theology had described for years. The testaments used the same language for everyone. The forensic evidence, by contrast, registered differences that the theological framework had erased. The investigation preserved both the documents and the forensic findings, and neither was permitted to cancel the other in the case record. The wooden chalets at Grangy-sur-Salvan had burned thoroughly enough that the forensic examination of the dead recovered from that site was in some respects more limited than the examination possible at Cherry, where the underground sanctuary had been partly protected from the fire above. The 25 people found at Grangy-sur-Salvan included the group's two principal founders, and the documentation of their deaths entered into the case file through the standard procedures of forensic identification, a process that in the alpine cold of October 1994 required the methodical work that every such process requires. The identifications were made and confirmed. Jure and DeMambro were among the dead. The case file recorded this without editorial comment, in the register appropriate to the recording of a fact. The incendiary device recovered from the wall cavity of the Cherry farmhouse was photographed on a forensic examination table in the days following the fire. The photograph shows a compact mechanical component, the remains of a timer mechanism, and an ignition element resting on a clean surface, a numbered evidence tag placed beside it in the lower right corner of the frame. The object is ordinary in its components. Timer mechanisms and ignition elements are not unusual technologies. What makes the device notable is the specificity of its installation, placed inside a wall, connected to a delay of precise duration, calibrated to activate at a particular hour in the early morning of a particular date. The planning that produced this object was detailed and deliberate. The case file holds the photograph. The object itself was retained as physical evidence. The Canton seal on the cover of the Swiss investigator's case file from October 1994 is a standard administrative mark, the official emblem of the relevant cantonal authority, pressed or stamped onto the cover in the routine manner of official documentation. Below it, the date, October 1994, rendered in the standard format of the Swiss administrative record. The interior pages begin where the site map is, the property drawing with its measured lines, the farmhouse above, and the sanctuary space below, the dotted line of the internal passage connecting them. From the site map, the file moves into the forensic documentation, the evidence inventory, the witness statements gathered from emergency responders, and the investigators who followed them. The case file was substantial by the time it was complete. It recorded as fully as the available methods allowed what had been found in the early hours of October 5th at a farmhouse in the canton of Fribourg, at 2 chalets in the canton of Valais, and across a body of documents and physical evidence that extended the investigation's scope well beyond those buildings into the years of the organization's operation before that night. The Morin Heights property in the Canadian record is documented in law enforcement files that remained sealed for years after the events of October 4th. The chalet's exterior, captured in archival photographs taken before law enforcement restricted access, shows a modest building set among trees, the kind of structure common to the Laurentian Mountains region, its architecture unremarkable, its setting quiet. The interior documentation exists within the sealed record. The 5 people found there, including the 3-month-old child and his parents, are named in the Canadian documents, in the press coverage that followed, and in the solar temple testaments that had been composed before any of these events occurred. The testaments had named the child in particular in terms that connected him to the group's internal theology, to a dispute between his parents and Di Mambro over the significance of his birth. The Canadian investigation examined this correspondence alongside the physical evidence at the Morin Heights site and incorporated it into the record. The timing across the 3 locations, Morin Heights on October 4th, Cherry and Granges-sur-Salvan on October 5th, suggests coordination. The investigation examined this coordination as a factual question. What communications, what planning, what logistical preparation would have been required for events to occur in the sequence and at the locations documented? The answer the record supports is that the preparation was extensive, that it involved multiple people in multiple countries, and that it had been underway for a significant period before the dates on which the events occurred. The testaments, the timed devices, the addressed envelopes, the arranged sanctuary, these were not the products of a single night's decisions. They were the material outputs of a plan that had been developed over months inside the group's inner circle. The charred exterior wall of one of the Granges-sur-Salvan chalets is visible in the Swiss authorities' photographs taken after the fire, the stone foundation at the base, the mountain terrain extending behind it, the material above the foundation line reduced to what the fire had left. The alpine setting makes no particular drama of the image. The mountains are simply there, as they always are, in the pale light of an early October morning in the Valais Canton. The investigators photographing the scene worked in that light, with the cold of that altitude, cataloging what the fire had left available to catalog. The photographs entered the case file. The case file entered the archive. The mountain landscape behind the charred wall and in every direction beyond the reach of the photograph remained as it had been. The financial records recovered during the investigation revealed that the group had maintained accounts and property holdings across several countries. The Swiss bank accounts, the property titles, the investment vehicles, these were part of a financial structure whose examination would extend the investigative work beyond the immediate forensic questions of October 1994 into the administrative and legal history of the organization across the preceding decade. Dimambro's name appeared on account documents. Property titles were held through organizational entities whose structure the investigation traced through Swiss and Canadian legal frameworks. The financial documentation was substantial, and it entered the case file alongside the forensic and documentary evidence as a distinct category of the record. The paper trail of an organization whose material reality was more extensive than what had been visible in its public-facing lecture events and initiatory ceremonies. The investigation proceeded through the months that followed October 1994 with the deliberate pace that complex multi-jurisdictional forensic work requires. Swiss cantonal authorities coordinated with federal agencies and with Canadian law enforcement counterparts. Evidence was cataloged, witnesses were interviewed, former members, neighbors of the Swiss properties, acquaintances of group members, emergency responders who had been among the first to reach the Cherry farmhouse on the morning of October 5th. The picture that accumulated in the case file was the picture of an organization that had operated for a decade across multiple countries, that had maintained a sophisticated internal structure of initiatory degrees and tiered knowledge, that had accumulated property and financial resources through membership fees and contributions, and that had, in October 1994, executed a plan whose preparation had been underway for a significant period before the fires that brought it to the attention of the Swiss authorities. The evidence markers in the forensic photographs of the Cherry Sanctuary, small yellow placards, each numbered in black, stand at measured intervals along the floor of the underground room. They mark the positions of objects before those objects were moved. They mark the perimeter of the circular arrangement of the dead before the bodies were removed for examination. They mark the location of the altar, the position of the projection apparatus in the wall recess, the positions of the ceremonial materials that had been arranged in the room before the ceremony of October 4th and 5 occurred. The markers are, in their function, a form of notation, a method of keeping the spatial record of a place before the work of investigation disturbs it. In the photographs, the room is still, the altar cloth is still in place, the projection equipment is still in the wall recess. The numbered placards stand in the amber light of the forensic team's portable lighting, and the room holds everything it has been asked to hold. The case file, completed over the course of the investigation and eventually stored in the cantonal archive, is thick. Its pages hold the site maps, the forensic reports, the evidence inventories, the testimony transcripts, the documentary analysis of the testaments, and the group's internal correspondence, the financial records, and the technical documentation of the incendiary devices. It is organized in the standard manner of Swiss cantonal legal documentation, sections tabbed, pages numbered, evidence referenced by the codes assigned to individual items at the time of their recovery. The canton seal appears on the cover, and the date appears below it, and the pages inside run to a total that reflects the complexity and duration of the investigation that produced them. The cover of the case file, in the dim light of the archive room where it was eventually stored, shows the canton stamp and the October 1994 date, with the clarity that official stamps are designed to provide: indelible, administrative, indifferent to the weight of what the interior pages hold. The file rests in the archive. The pages inside are in order. The evidence they reference is cataloged in the inventory systems of the cantonal authority. The photographs are stored, the forensic reports are filed, the testimony transcripts are bound and dated and held in the manner of the official record. The underground room at Cherry, the stone foundations at Granges-sur-Salvan, the mountain terrain of the Valais Canton, and the Laurentian mountain setting of the Morin Heights Chalet. These places exist in the physical world and in the documentary record simultaneously, and the case file holds the version of them that the investigation was able to produce in the months of work that began in the early hours of October 5th, 1994, when emergency services arrived at a farmhouse in the canton of Fribourg and found steps leading down through a narrow doorway into a circular room below. The canton stamp is visible in the dim light. The date is visible below it. The file is in its place. The archive holds what the archive holds, and the record does not end at the cover. It continues, page by page, in the interior of the folder, in the order established by the investigation, complete in the manner that a documented record can be complete, which is to say, as complete as the available evidence and the available methods were able to make it, and no more than that, and no less. The closed cover of the Swiss investigator's case file rests in the archive where it was eventually stored, the canton seal pressed into the surface, and the October 1994 date sitting below it in the still and quiet of a room where documents are kept, where the light is low, where the air is cool and does not move, and where the interior of the file, its pages, its maps, its photographs, its numbered evidence references, its carefully maintained record of what was found on a night in October in the cantons of Fribourg and Valais, remains exactly as it was left, in order, in the dark, in the archive, holding its account of what occurred. In the gray December light of 1995, a French investigative team photographed a forest clearing on the Vercors Plateau from above. The image shows a circle of dark pines at the edge of the frame, their tops dusted with snow, the open ground between them marked by an arrangement that the investigators' notes describe as star-shaped. The snow held the shape clear. The aerial photograph was taken before anyone entered the clearing, and in it the scene appears geometric and still, as though the arrangement had been there long enough to become part of the landscape, as though the forest had simply grown around it. 16 people were found there. 3 of them were children. The date was December 23rd, 14 months after the fires in Cherry and Granges-sur-Salvan, and the discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected since examining the Solar Temple's written testaments, that the movement had not ended in October 1994. Surviving members had continued to meet, to correspond, and to prepare. The Vercors site was not a spontaneous event. The arrangement of the site, the timing, the written materials found nearby, all of it showed the same quality of long deliberate preparation that investigators had documented in Switzerland and Quebec. The third and final transit event was recorded on March 20th, 1997, in St. Casimir, Quebec, where 5 members were found dead. The date coincided with the spring equinox. The solar calendar, which had provided the group's founding imagery and its ritual calendar, had framed the final event as precisely as the first. What remained after all 3 sets of events was a documentary record, large, scattered across jurisdictions, and in several respects still incomplete, and a population of survivors whose accounts would, over the following years, become the most detailed available record of what the Solar Temple had actually been from the inside. These were people who had attended the ceremonies in the Agarthy sanctuary, who had advanced through the initiatory degrees, who had listened in the charged atmosphere of the ritual chamber to voices that seemed to arrive from beyond the walls. Their accounts did not always agree on detail, and investigators and journalists handling them noted that memory in high-control environments is rarely straightforward. But across multiple testimonies, certain features of the group's interior life appeared consistently enough to be treated as established. Rosemarie Klaus gave some of the most detailed testimony available regarding the technical mechanics of the Agartha sanctuary. Her account described how the projection and lighting equipment installed beneath the Cherry farmhouse had been used to manufacture what members were told were genuine supernatural manifestations, apparitions, glowing presences, phenomena that seemed to arise spontaneously from the ritual space itself. The equipment was compact and professionally installed. Investigators examining the sanctuary after October 1994 found it fitted into a recess in the wall, its lens aimed toward the center of the chamber, and their reports describe it in clinical terms: a projection apparatus of the kind used in theatrical staging, its mechanism set to activate at predetermined points in the ceremony sequence. The effect it produced in members who did not know it existed was something Klaus described as genuinely overwhelming. The ceremonies were conducted in a low-ceilinged space with controlled lighting, in robes, following a ritual sequence that members had been prepared for over months or years of initiatory advancement. The projection appeared within this atmosphere as something the setting had already made the mind ready to receive. Klaus's account does not suggest that members were simply fooled by a crude mechanism. The mechanics of the deception were more subtle than that, and the psychological preparation that preceded each ceremony was part of what made the technology effective. A light in an empty room produces one response. A light in the same room after years of initiatory preparation, surrounded by ceremony, in the presence of people one trusts completely, produces something else entirely. The concealed audio system recovered from within the sanctuary walls documented a second layer of the same technique. Swiss forensic investigators noted it in their evidence inventory between two other numbered items on a typewritten log: a compact audio unit, its speaker components discreetly positioned, its wiring running through the cavity of the wall to a control point outside the ritual chamber. Multiple former members described hearing voices during ceremonies. The voices were attributed to spiritual masters and ascended beings. They arrived without visible source in a space that had been made by the architecture and the ritual sequence to receive exactly that kind of arrival. Former members who testified about these experiences described the psychological impact in terms of certainty rather than wonder, not the feeling of having witnessed something strange, but of having had something confirmed that they had long believed. The voices did not introduce new information, they affirmed what was already known. That distinction, several investigators and researchers later noted, is a consistent feature of suggestion-based experience in ritual settings. The encounter ratifies rather than reveals. What these testimonies established, taken together, was not simply that DiMambro had deceived the group's members, but that the deception had been engineered with considerable technical and psychological sophistication over many years. The mechanism was not merely a projector and a speaker. It was a complete staging environment. The architecture of the sanctuary, the sequence of the ceremonies, the initiatory preparation that preceded each degree of advancement. Puri stateside respected Doctrine, the social world that gave the group its coherence, and the technical apparatus was embedded within that environment, so that its effects would be indistinguishable from the theological claims the group made about the nature of the space. The projector did not produce a special effect. It produced an encounter with the divine within a world that had been built specifically to make that encounter feel inevitable. Financial investigators working across Swiss and Canadian jurisdictions built a parallel account of what had run beneath the theological surface of the group. The records they subpoenaed showed a systematic pattern: initiation fees paid by members, contributions described as preparatory offerings for the transit, property assets transferred by members who had been told that worldly holdings were incompatible with approaching departure, a Swiss bank account statement that appears in investigation documentation shows columns of figures in a standard banking format, transfer dates running across years, the account holder's name printed in ordinary type at the top of the page. The sums recorded are not small. The account had accumulated steadily across the years of the group's most active operation, the period during which Jouret's lectures were drawing the largest audiences, and the initiatory hierarchy was processing the most new members. Denis Mambro had accumulated significant personal wealth. He had done so through the same institutional structure, the fees, the hierarchy, the property arrangements that had been presented to members as the organizational form of a cosmic mission. The financial record places the two things side by side without requiring interpretation. Here are the theological documents describing the necessity of releasing material attachments, and here, in the same period, are the bank transfer records showing where those attachments went. The investigation did not find that all of the group's financial activity was directed toward personal enrichment. Some funds were used for operational purposes, property maintenance, the costs of the ceremonies, travel for Jouret's lecture tours, but the diversion was substantial and systematic, and investigators described it as having been concealed from lower degree members through the same layered initiatory structure that concealed the group's more radical doctrines. The members who paid these fees were not in the main people who could be described as naive or uninformed in their ordinary professional lives. The membership of the Solar Temple had included doctors, lawyers, local officials, business people, people who managed money and contracts and institutional structures in their working lives, and who might, in any other context, have asked more questions about where the contributions were going and what was being done with the assets they transferred. The investigation records do not comment on this directly. They simply document what was found. But the testimony of former members who had left before 1994 returns often to the question of the social environment within the group, the reinforcement of belief by other respected, educated people, the way that professional credentials operated within the group, not as a basis for skepticism, but as confirmation that the group's claims had been evaluated and found credible by people qualified to evaluate them. Jean-Francois Meyer, a Swiss scholar of new religious movements, had been conducting fieldwork in and around the Solar Temple during the years before the October events. He had interviewed former members, attended public events, and accumulated a substantial archive of documentary material, internal texts, ceremonial records, accounts of ritual practice. After October 1994, his archive became one of the most detailed scholarly records of the group's interior life, and he continued to conduct interviews in the following years with former members and survivors, building a case file that eventually ran to hundreds of pages. The manila folders in which these transcripts were stored carry anonymized reference codes, individual identifiers replaced by letter number combinations that made the accounts usable in research contexts while protecting the identities of people whose involvement in the group had often not been publicly known. The Meyer archive sits in a Swiss university collection. The folders are slightly worn at the corners. The penciled reference codes on the tabs are legible but faded. the kind of notation made quickly during sorting and never updated. And each folder holds a transcript, dense pages of interview text, questions and responses, occasional marginal notes in a different hand, where a researcher following up on a particular thread has marked a passage for cross-reference. Taken together, the transcripts cover aspects of Solar Temple life that no other documentary source addresses in comparable depth. The texture of daily experience within the group, the way beliefs were communicated and reinforced at different levels of the hierarchy, the specific moments at which individual members began to feel that something within the group had changed, and the equally specific moments at which they found ways to disengage or to stay. The academic literature that followed drew heavily on this archive. It also drew on the group's own documents, the testaments, the initiatory certificates, the internal correspondence, which had survived in copies or in the collections of recipients who had not destroyed them. Researchers examining these materials produced studies of the Solar Temple that approached the group from frameworks developed for understanding high-control religious movements more broadly, situating its particular doctrines and methods within patterns visible across a wider range of communities and historical periods. The Solar Temple's theology was unusual in its specific synthesis: the Templar lineage, the solar cosmology, the Sirius destination, but the organizational mechanics through which that theology was administered, maintained, and made psychologically real for members were recognizable to scholars who had studied other groups with different doctrines and the same structural architecture. France's response to the October 1994 deaths moved through several institutional stages. The Gaillard Report, produced for the French National Assembly and published in 1995, listed 172 organizations categorized as dangerous sects. It is a thick document with a plain government cover. The list of organizations begins on page 43, and the Solar Temple appears among them, alongside groups of very different character, movements with millions of members and movements with dozens, movements operating in France, and movements headquartered elsewhere but active among French citizens. The inclusion of so many disparate organizations in a single governmental document was itself a significant political act, and it was not without controversy. Several of the listed groups contested their categorization, and the report's methodology was debated in academic and legal context for years afterward. The eventual legislative response was France's About Picard law, passed in 2001, which established criminal liability for the psychological manipulation of vulnerable individuals by the leaders of cultic groups. The law was the most direct institutional response to emerge from the sequence of events that the Solar Temple had begun, and it was crafted specifically to address the gap in French criminal law that had become apparent when investigators attempted to prosecute cult leaders for harms that did not fit neatly into existing categories of fraud, coercion, or incitement. Psychological manipulation, as the law defined it, involved the systematic exploitation of a person's diminished capacity for autonomous judgment, a condition that the law recognized could be produced by the kind of initiatory environment the Solar Temple had constructed, without physical coercion and without any single identifiable act that crossed a prior legal threshold. Switzerland implemented its own set of monitoring and interagency coordination measures in the years following 1994. These drew on the investigative experience accumulated across the Chariot Grange's Sir Salvan investigations, the questions that had arisen about how an organization of this kind could operate for years across multiple jurisdictions without triggering the kind of institutional attention that might have produced earlier intervention. The Swiss measures became reference points for policy discussions within the European Union, contributing to a broader conversation about the appropriate scope of state monitoring of private religious organizations, the evidentiary standards required before such monitoring could be initiated, and the tensions between religious freedom and the protection of members from organizational harms. These policy conversations did not resolve cleanly. They are in some respects still ongoing. The About Picard law has been applied in French courts with varying results, its provisions tested against the difficulty of establishing, in a specific case, what constitutes diminished autonomous judgment, rather than freely chosen belief. The Solar Temple case is cited in the academic literature on these questions, not as a simple illustration, but as a genuinely complicated one, a case in which the range of members' experiences was wide, in which the line between willing participant and deceived victim was not always where it first appeared, and in which the full picture emerged only gradually through years of investigation, testimony, and documentary research. The bodies found in the Vercors clearing on December 23, 1995, were examined by French forensic investigators, following methods developed in part from the Swiss investigations of the previous year. Their work added to a documentary record that by this point extended across 2 continents and 3 countries, held in archives maintained by Swiss cantonal authorities, French judicial investigators, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and private researchers. The records are not all in the same format or organized according to the same principles. Some of the documentary material that investigators had hoped to examine had been destroyed by the fires, by the incendiary devices, and in some cases by members who had removed or burned materials before the October events. What survived was substantial but not complete, and researchers working in this area have consistently noted the places where the record goes quiet, periods that are undocumented, communications that left no written trace, decisions whose internal reasoning has to be reconstructed from external evidence because the people who made them are no longer available to describe it. The financial investigation's reach extended into the period before the group's most intensive preparations for the transit, tracing the movement of funds across years of ordinary organizational operation. The picture that emerged was not of a single large fraud, but of a long-running system, fees collected, assets transferred, accounts maintained in Switzerland and elsewhere, the flow of money through the group's hierarchy, following its own internal logic, while operating in parallel with the theological logic that members were presented with as the organization's purpose. Former members who learned the details of the financial investigation after the fact described reactions that ranged from quiet recognition to profound disorientation, the difficulty of integrating the financial record with their own experience of having believed, genuinely, in the cosmological framework within which those transactions had been presented to them. The academic work that engaged most carefully with these testimonies was cautious about the nature of that disorientation. Scholars studying the aftermath of high-control religious movements had documented similar responses in other contexts. The specific cognitive difficulty of holding simultaneously the reality of one's own experienced belief and the documented reality of the mechanisms that had shaped it. The two things are not contradictory in the way that might first appear. That a belief was produced by conditions engineered to produce it does not mean it was not genuinely held. The experience in the sanctuary was real, even when what produced it was a projector in a wall recess. The accounts of former members reflect this. They describe not simple disillusionment, but something more complicated, a re-examination of a body of experience whose meaning had shifted without the experience itself being retracted. The Solar Temple was formally dissolved as an active organization After the St. Casimir events of March 1997, the legal processes associated with the three transit sites continued for years afterward, the Swiss proceedings in particular running through multiple stages of cantonal and federal review. No criminal prosecution ever reached the individuals at the center of the planning and execution of the transit, for the straightforward reason that those individuals had themselves died in October 1994. The criminal investigations established what had happened, documented how it had been prepared, and identified the roles played by the people involved. But the prosecutorial dimension of the cases was shaped throughout by the fact that the core decision-makers were not available to face it. Some peripheral figures, people who had participated in planning without being among the dead, people who had been present at properties connected to the events but had survived, were investigated, and in some cases charged under various provisions of Swiss and French law. These proceedings produced additional documentary material, including testimony about the final months of the group's operation that supplemented what the written record had already established. The outcomes of these proceedings were modest relative to the scale of what had been investigated. What the full documentary record shows, assembled across the years following 1994, is an organization whose interior life was considerably more layered than its public presentation had suggested. The lecture circuit that Jouret had maintained across French-speaking Europe and Quebec had presented a recognizable and professionally credentialed figure offering thoughtful commentary on environmental crisis and the need for personal and planetary transformation. The initiatory hierarchy that received members who were drawn in through those lectures had added, degree by degree, an increasingly specific and radical theological content that was not visible to outside observers and was only gradually revealed to members themselves. The technical infrastructure installed in the sanctuary had manufactured experiences that confirmed the theology at an experiential level that doctrine alone could not reach. The financial system had operated throughout as a parallel structure, accumulating resources on premises that the theological framework made it difficult for members to question. And the written record, the testaments, the astronomical charts, the correspondence about Shoemaker Livy 9 had prepared in formal language and with deliberate care the framework within which the transit would be understood by those who undertook it and by the outside world that would receive the documentation afterward. The sealed envelopes that investigators photographed on the table inside the Swiss property, addressed to journalists, to former members, to government officials, each in the same careful hand, were part of this prepared documentary framework. They were intended to be read. They were composed with an audience in mind. The testaments they contained were written in the measured language of a theological position paper, presenting the transit in terms the authors regarded as precise and accurate, offering a final account of the group's beliefs and purposes in the form of a communication to the world being left behind. Investigators noted that the envelopes remained undisturbed for weeks after the October events, photographed in their original arrangement, before being opened and processed as evidence. None of the intended recipients ever answered them. The communications were received as documentation rather than as the theological dispatches they had been composed to be. The astronomical chart with Dimambro's annotations, Sirius and Jupiter, and the Sun connected by ruled lines. The terms from the group's internal cosmology, written in French in the margins, appears in the research literature as an illustration of how the transit doctrine mapped itself onto real astronomical phenomena. The comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 had been a genuine event, documented by astronomers around the world and widely covered in the news. The dark impact scars it left on Jupiter's surface in July 1994 were photographed and published. DeMambro had incorporated those images into internal communications as cosmic confirmation, placing a real astronomical occurrence within the interpretive framework the group had developed across years of doctrinal elaboration. The act of pointing to a real event and reading it as a signal is not unique to the solar temple. It appears in the history of millenarian and apocalyptic movements across many centuries and many cultural contexts. What distinguished the solar temple's use of it was the density of the doctrinal framework into which the signal was being received, and the proximity of its reception to the events that followed. The academic literature on millenarian movements provides comparative context for this, without resolving the specific questions the solar temple's case raises. The relationship between an apocalyptic belief system and the decision of its holders to enact rather than wait for the prophesied end is one of the more difficult problems in the field, and the solar temple's transit doctrine makes it more complicated rather than less. The transit was not an anticipation of external catastrophe. It was not a preparation for a disaster that the group expected to survive, but a decision to move, voluntarily and in a state of preparation, through the threshold that separated the current world from the solar realm beyond it. The cosmology framed death not as an ending, but as a passage whose destination had been described and whose mechanics had been prepared. Whether any given member who died in October 1994 held this belief at the time of death, whether they held it freely and with full information, or whether they were among those the forensic evidence placed in a different category altogether. These are questions the record answers partially, and for some individuals not at all. The forensic record established that a significant number of the dead in the Swiss sites had been killed by others. Bound hands, injection marks, wounds inconsistent with self-infliction. These findings appeared in the investigators' reports and were summarized in the Swiss judicial proceedings. They established that the category of willing participant and the category of victim were not the same category, and that both were present within the circle of the dead. The investigation could not always determine, in specific cases, which category applied. The picture that emerged was not a simple one, and researchers who have written about the solar temple with care have consistently acknowledged that complexity rather than smoothing it into a cleaner account. The clearing in the Vercors forest was photographed in December 1995 before anyone disturbed it, and the aerial image shows the shape of the arrangement in the snow with a precision that the written descriptions in investigative reports do not entirely convey. Snow holds things. The shape that was left in it that December was geometric and deliberate, and the forest around it was quiet in the way that forests in that region are quiet in winter, the trees holding their snow, the light gray, and even across the plateau. French investigators examining the site worked within protocols developed from the Swiss experience, applying methods that had been refined in the 14 months between the two events. Their documentation of the Vercors site is thorough. It sits now in the judicial archive of the relevant French court, alongside the Swiss cantonal files and the Canadian investigative records, in the larger distributed archive that constitutes the documentary record of the Solar Temple's history. That archive is not a single place. It is spread across jurisdictions and institutions, court files, forensic inventories, financial investigation records, the mayor interview transcripts at the Swiss university, the government reports, the academic publications, the journalistic accounts. No single researcher has seen all of it. Some of it is still sealed under judicial confidentiality provisions. Some of it has been reviewed but not published. The portions that are accessible to scholars and researchers form a picture that is detailed in some areas and sparse in others. the gaps marking the places where material was destroyed or never created, or created and not preserved, or preserved in archives whose access conditions have not been met. The Bout-Picard Law, passed in France in 2001 and named for its sponsors in the National Assembly, remains in force. It has been applied in cases unrelated to the Solar Temple, and its provisions have been examined in legal scholarship as an example of one country's attempt to legislate against a harm that does not fit neatly into traditional criminal categories. The law's critics have argued that its definition of psychological manipulation is too broad, that it risks criminalizing persuasion and belief in forms that do not warrant state intervention. Its supporters have argued that it addresses a real harm that existing law had proved inadequate to reach. Both arguments appear in the academic and legal literature on the law, and neither has settled the question definitively. The Solar Temple is the case the law was, in significant part, designed to respond to, and the distance between the law's provisions and the specific circumstances of the group's operation is a measure of how difficult it was to translate what investigators had found into a form that legislation could address. The last transit event in St. Casimir, Quebec, in March 1997 was smaller than the earlier ones, 5 people. The date was the spring equinox. The solar calendar had provided the framework for the group's ritual life throughout its operation, and it provided the framework for the final documented event as well. After March 1997, no further transit events were recorded. The investigation was closed. The legal proceedings ran their course. The academic literature continued to develop, drawing on the documentary record and on the testimony of the people who had been part of the group and had survived it. Jean-Francois Meyer continued his research in the years following the events, publishing analyses that drew on his pre-1994 fieldwork and on the interviews he conducted afterward. His work approached the Solar Temple without the sensationalizing framing that characterized much of the early journalistic coverage, and it contributed to a scholarly literature on new religious movements that placed the Solar Temple in comparative context, not as an inexplicable anomaly, but as a case that, however extreme in its outcome, was comprehensible through the frameworks the field had developed. The interviews in the Manila folders represent, in this context, something worth preserving, not because they resolve the questions the case raises, but because they hold the accounts of people who experienced the Solar Temple from the inside and were willing, in the months and years after its end, to describe what that experience had been. The filing drawer in which the folders sit closes quietly. The anonymized codes on the tabs are faded but legible.